"You don't belong in this house anymore," my brother said, standing in the doorway of the living room I had cleaned every Saturday for more than 50 years. I remember the exact way the late afternoon light came through the old oak tree outside the window, the same tree my father planted when I was a child. It cast long shadows across the carpet I had vacuumed that very morning, as if the house itself was quietly listening to what was happening. I was 72 years old when my younger brother Daniel told me that the home I had lived in for more than half a century was no longer mine to stay in. The strange thing is, I didn't feel angry at first. I felt tired. The kind of tired that settles deep in your bones after a lifetime of carrying responsibilities no one else wanted. Daniel crossed his arms like he was trying to look confident, though he couldn't quite meet my eyes. Behind him stood our sister Linda and our youngest brother Michael. All three of them were dressed well, the kind of comfortable success that comes from long careers and stable lives. For a moment, I studied their faces the way a mother studies her children when they're trying to hide something. And in many ways, that's exactly what they were to me. Children. Because the truth is, I was only 18 years old when I became the parent in this house. Back then, the world looked very different. Our father had just passed away suddenly, leaving behind a quiet house, a grieving mother who could barely get out of bed, and 3 frightened kids who didn't understand why everything had changed overnight. I still remember that first week like it happened yesterday. The kitchen felt too quiet in the mornings. The coffee pot sat cold on the counter. Bills started appearing in the mailbox with our last name printed neatly across the envelopes. Someone had to take care of things. Someone had to keep the lights on, make dinner, drive the kids to school, and pretend everything was going to be okay. That someone became me. I postponed my college plans. I took the first job I could find at a small grocery store 3 miles down the road, working early morning shifts and evening hours whenever the manager needed help. I learned how to stretch a dollar, how to cook simple meals that could feed 4 people, how to fix a leaking faucet with a wrench and a little patience. While other girls my age were thinking about campus life and summer road trips, I was thinking about electric bills and grocery receipts. Daniel was only 9 at the time. Michael was 7. Linda was 12 and trying her best to be brave, but I could see the fear in her eyes when the house went quiet at night. So I filled the silence. I packed lunches. I checked homework. I sat through school concerts and parent meetings, signing my name on forms where it asked for a guardian. Slowly, without anyone ever saying it out loud, I became the parent in our home. And for a long time, that role felt natural. I didn't question it. I believed that family meant showing up when it mattered most. I believed that sacrifice was simply what love looked like. For decades, this house held all those memories. Every wall carried a piece of our history. The scratch marks near the hallway door from when Daniel practiced throwing a baseball indoors. The faded corner of the kitchen table where Michael used to do his math homework. The old living room sofa where Linda cried the night before her wedding because she was nervous about leaving home. I stood there in that same living room now, looking at the 3 of them, wondering how the years had carried us from those fragile beginnings to this strange moment where my own brother could say the words, "You don't belong here anymore," as if everything that came before had somehow disappeared. Daniel shifted his weight in the doorway, and for a moment the room felt smaller than it ever had before, as if the walls themselves were leaning inward to hear what would happen next. I looked at him carefully, the same way I used to when he was a boy trying to explain why a baseball had shattered the kitchen window. Back then his voice always carried a trace of guilt before he even spoke. Now he sounded practiced, almost rehearsed. "We have been talking about the house," he said slowly, glancing toward Linda and Michael as if drawing courage from their presence. The word "we" lingered in the air like a quiet announcement that decisions had already been made somewhere else. I nodded once and rested my hands on the back of the old dining chair that had stood in that same spot for decades. The wood felt smooth under my fingers from years of polishing. "Talking about what exactly?" I asked. My voice sounded calm, but inside my chest something old and heavy was beginning to stir. Linda stepped forward first. She always had a gentle way of speaking, the same voice she used when she asked for help with algebra homework more than 50 years ago. "Margaret," she said softly, "this house is just too big for one person now." Too big. I looked around the living room again, at the faded curtains and the framed photographs lining the walls. Every picture told a piece of our family story. Daniel in his Little League uniform at 10 years old, grinning through a gap, where his front tooth had fallen out. Michael standing proudly beside the second-hand car I helped him buy when he graduated from high school. Linda on her wedding day, holding my hand so tightly that my fingers had gone numb. Too big. I wondered how a house that had once held so many people could suddenly feel too big simply because I was the only one still living inside it. Michael cleared his throat and stepped beside Daniel. A realtor friend of mine said properties in this neighborhood are selling fast right now, he explained. The market is strong. We could get a very good price. There it was. The real reason. Not concern. Not practicality. Opportunity. I had seen that look before in the grocery store where I worked as a teenager, when customers watched the weekly sales board and waited for the exact moment something became profitable. We could divide the money evenly, Daniel added quickly. It would help all of us. Retirement costs are rising, and the taxes on this place are getting higher every year. Divide the money evenly. The phrase echoed in my mind with a strange hollow sound. I thought about the winter when the furnace broke and I spent 3 nights learning how to repair it with a manual from the hardware store, because we could not afford a technician. I thought about the years I paid the property taxes by picking up extra shifts during the holiday season, wrapping groceries in paper bags while Christmas music played through the store speakers. I thought about the thousands of mornings I woke up before sunrise to keep this house running so my younger siblings could grow up feeling safe. Yet none of those memories appeared to exist in this conversation. To them, the house had become something simpler, something measurable in square feet and market value. I slowly walked toward the fireplace where an old photograph of our father still sat on the mantel. The frame was slightly crooked, just the way it always had been since the day Linda bumped it while dusting years ago. His face looked calm in the picture, the quiet confidence of a man who believed his family would always take care of one another. For a moment, I wondered what he would think if he could see us now, standing in the living room he once built with his own hands. Behind me, Daniel spoke again, his tone firmer this time. It makes sense for everyone, Margaret. You could move somewhere smaller. Maybe a nice apartment. Somewhere easier to manage. I turned back slowly and studied each of their faces. Daniel looked determined. Michael avoided my eyes. Linda looked uncomfortable, though she said nothing to stop the conversation. And suddenly I understood something that had taken me decades to learn. Families do not always remember sacrifice the way you hope they will. Sometimes they remember only what benefits them now. I took a quiet breath and folded my hands together. So you are telling me, I said gently, that after all these years, the 3 of you believe the best solution is for me to leave the only home I have ever known. None of them answered right away. The silence that followed stretched across the room like a long shadow in the late afternoon sun. Daniel finally broke the silence with a short breath, the kind people take when they believe the conversation has already been settled. It is not like that, he said, though his voice carried more impatience than comfort. We are just being realistic. Realistic. That word felt strangely unfamiliar in the room where I had spent most of my life making unrealistic sacrifices. I walked slowly toward the window and looked out at the front yard. The grass was freshly cut, the same way I had kept it every summer for decades. The old oak tree still stood tall near the sidewalk, its branches stretching across the lawn just as they had when we were children. I remembered Daniel climbing that tree when he was 8 years old, yelling for me to watch him reach the highest branch. I had stood below with my hands ready, just in case he slipped. Back then he trusted that I would always be there. I wondered when that trust had quietly turned into something else. Realistic about what? I asked calmly without turning around. About the fact that this house belongs to the family, Michael said. His voice was firmer now, almost businesslike. Dad left it to all of us. That means we should all benefit from it. I turned back slowly. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality. For a moment I studied their expressions again, noticing how comfortable they looked discussing something that had shaped my entire life. Linda avoided my gaze, adjusting the strap of her purse the way she used to when she was nervous during school presentations. Daniel stood with his shoulders squared, as if he had practiced this moment in advance. Michael glanced toward the hallway, perhaps already imagining the property listed on a real estate website. You all seem very certain, I said softly. Did any of you ever ask how the house stayed standing all these years? Daniel frowned slightly. What do you mean? I walked toward the kitchen doorway and rested my hand on the counter. The edge of the laminate surface had a small chip in it from when a heavy pot slipped out of my hands 20 years ago. I had repaired it myself with a small kit from the hardware store. There were dozens of little marks like that throughout the house, quiet reminders of the years spent keeping everything together. After Dad passed away, I began slowly. The bank sent the first mortgage notice 3 weeks later. Mom could barely leave her bedroom. The three of you were too young to understand what was happening. I paused and watched their faces carefully. Daniel's expression shifted slightly, though he said nothing. The payment was $280 a month back then. I continued. It might not sound like much now, but when you are 18 years old and earning $2 an hour at a grocery store, it feels like a mountain. The room remained silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock above the refrigerator. So I worked, I said. Morning shifts, evening shifts, holiday shifts when everyone else wanted to stay home. I learned how to stretch every dollar until it felt like two. I could see small flickers of memory in Linda's eyes now, fragments of the past returning quietly. The furnace broke one winter when Daniel was in middle school, I added. The repair bill was more than I earned in 2 weeks. So I spent 3 nights reading the manual and fixing it myself. Michael shifted uncomfortably. Daniel looked down at the floor for the first time since the conversation began. I folded my hands together and spoke gently, not with anger, but with the calm clarity that comes after many years of reflection. You see this house as property, I said. A number on a market report. But to me it was something else. It was responsibility. It was the promise I made the night our father died, standing in this very kitchen, that the three of you would always have a place to come home to. I let the words settle slowly between us. Outside, a car passed quietly down the street. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed. The neighborhood carried on with its ordinary afternoon, while our family stood in the middle of a truth none of them had fully considered before. Daniel finally lifted his head again, though the confidence in his expression had faded slightly. Margaret, he said carefully, no one is denying that you helped. But things are different now. I nodded once. Yes, I said quietly. They are very different now. Daniel looked at me carefully after I spoke, as if he was trying to measure whether my words carried anger or simply memory. The truth was there was very little anger left inside me. Anger burns hot when you are young, but after enough years it cools into something quieter, something steadier. I walked slowly toward the living room sofa and sat down, the cushions dipping the same familiar way they had for decades. For a moment no one spoke. The clock continued its steady ticking above the hallway, marking time the way it always had, never rushing, never slowing. I remembered the day I brought that clock home from a small second-hand store. 15 miles away. Daniel had been 13 then, and Michael had just started high school. Money had been tight, but the store owner sold it to me for $12 because the chime was slightly off. I spent an entire evening adjusting the small brass pieces until it rang correctly again. Small things like that had filled my life for years. Fixing what was broken. Keeping time moving forward. Daniel cleared his throat again. Margaret, nobody is saying you did not work hard, he said. But this house was always meant to belong to all of us. Dad wanted things to be fair. I listened to his words carefully. Fair. It was an interesting word, one people used when they believed fairness meant equal numbers on paper. But life had never been measured in neat columns the way accountants preferred. Linda finally spoke, her voice softer than before. We just think it would make sense to move forward together, she said. Selling the house would help everyone. We could divide the money 4 ways. That would be fair. 4 ways. I repeated the phrase silently in my mind. 4 ways for a lifetime of repairs, payments, and quiet decisions made while everyone else slept peacefully upstairs. I looked toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. The paint along that corridor had been refreshed at least 6 times over the years. Each coat covered another chapter of our lives. I remembered helping Michael paint his room when he was 16 because he wanted dark blue walls like the ones he saw in a magazine. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table late at night helping Daniel finish a history project that was due the next morning. I remembered sewing a loose button onto Linda's coat before her first job interview because she was too nervous to do it herself. All of those moments had happened inside this house. They were not investments. They were not transactions. They were simply life. I folded my hands together and spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. When our father passed away, the 3 of you were children, I said. You needed stability. You needed someone to make sure the lights stayed on and the door stayed locked at night. That was my responsibility. Michael shifted slightly and rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture he used whenever he felt uncertain. Daniel looked down again, his confidence fading little by little as the conversation moved further into the past. For years I did not think about ownership, I continued. I thought about survival, about keeping this family together until each of you could build your own lives. Linda's eyes glistened slightly now, though she remained quiet. I could tell memories were returning to her the same way they had returned to me. The long car rides to school, when our old sedan struggled to start on cold winter mornings. The homemade birthday cakes that leaned slightly to one side, because I did not own proper baking pans yet. The nights when we all sat in this very living room listening to the radio, because we could not afford cable television. Those were not difficult memories. In many ways they were the strongest years of our lives. We depended on one another then. The house was not something we owned. It was something we protected. Daniel finally lifted his head again. His voice sounded quieter now. Things were different back then, he said carefully. I nodded slowly. Yes, I replied. Back then we understood what family meant. The room remained quiet after my last words, the kind of silence that does not feel empty but heavy, as if the air itself is carrying the weight of everything that has been left unsaid for too many years. Daniel shifted again, pacing a few steps across the living room rug that I had cleaned just 2 days earlier. His shoes made a soft sound against the fabric, and for a brief moment I remembered another time he stood in almost the same place. Only he had been 12 years old then and nervous about a school presentation the next day. He had asked me to listen while he practiced. I sat on the sofa just like this and nodded encouragingly every time he stumbled over a sentence. Now he looked older, more certain of himself, but the hesitation in his eyes told me he still knew something about this situation did not feel entirely right. Margaret, he said slowly, no one is trying to erase what you did for us. We appreciate it. But appreciation does not change the fact that the house belongs to all 4 of us. I listened carefully to the way he used the word appreciation, the same polite word people use when someone holds the door open for them at a store. Appreciation is easy. Gratitude is something very different. I stood up from the sofa and walked toward the hallway where an old wooden cabinet stood against the wall. The cabinet had been there for decades, long enough that everyone in the family probably stopped noticing it years ago. But I noticed it every day. Inside were small folders, carefully organized, each one holding pieces of the life that had unfolded within these walls. I opened the cabinet slowly and pulled out a thin folder with slightly yellowed edges. The paper inside had grown delicate over time, but the writing was still clear. When I turned back toward the living room, all 3 of them were watching me now with quiet curiosity. Linda tilted her head slightly. Michael crossed his arms again. Daniel waited, his expression cautious. I held the folder gently in both hands. When Dad passed away, I said calmly. The lawyer came to the house 2 weeks later. You probably do not remember that day. Daniel was playing outside. Michael was watching television in the living room. Linda was helping Mom upstairs. I could see the faint recognition beginning to appear in Linda's eyes as she searched her memory. The lawyer explained the paperwork to me. I continued. Not because I was the oldest, but because I was the only one old enough to sign certain documents. I opened the folder carefully and looked down at the paper for a moment before speaking again. Dad understood something before he passed away. He understood that keeping a family together sometimes requires one person to carry more responsibility than the others. The room was completely still now. Even the ticking clock seemed quieter. Daniel stepped forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to see the paper in my hands. What is that? He asked. I looked up at him gently. This, I said, is the document our father left behind that day. Michael shifted his weight, suddenly less confident than he had been earlier. Linda's expression grew serious, as if she was beginning to sense that the conversation was moving somewhere unexpected. I walked back toward the coffee table and carefully placed the document on its surface so they could all see it. The paper was simple, not dramatic, just a typed page with a few signatures and a small notary seal in the corner. But its meaning had quietly shaped the last 50 years of my life. Daniel leaned forward and scanned the page quickly. His eyes moved across the lines once, then again more slowly. The change in his expression happened gradually, like clouds drifting across the sun. Wait, he said quietly, reading one line again. Michael stepped closer beside him. Linda followed, her hands folded nervously. I remained standing a few feet away, watching them discover something I had known for half a century. Finally, Daniel looked up at me again, confusion written clearly across his face. "This says the house was transferred to your name," he said slowly. I nodded once. "Yes," I replied calmly. "It was." Daniel stared at the document, as if the words might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. Michael leaned closer over his shoulder, reading the same line again with a growing stiffness in his posture. Linda covered her mouth lightly with one hand, her eyes moving slowly across the page as the realization settled in. The room felt quieter than it had all afternoon. Outside the front window, a breeze moved gently through the oak tree, and its shadow shifted across the carpet in slow, steady patterns. For a long moment, none of them spoke. I remained standing near the coffee table, watching their faces with the calm patience that comes after many years of learning not to rush difficult truths. Daniel finally straightened up and looked at me again, the earlier confidence gone from his voice. "Why did you never tell us?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried decades of misunderstanding inside it. I folded my hands together in front of me and considered the answer carefully. "Because it was never meant to change how we treated each other," I said quietly. "Your father did not leave this house to me so that I could hold it over anyone. He left it to me because someone needed the authority to keep everything stable." Michael shook his head slowly, still processing the information. "But if the house was yours all this time," he said, "why did you keep acting like we all shared it?" I gave a small, gentle smile. "Because in many ways we did share it," I replied. "You grew up here. You built your lives here. Ownership on paper does not erase the memories that belong to everyone." Linda lowered her hand and looked toward the hallway as if she were seeing it differently now. "Dad must have trusted you a great deal," she said softly. I nodded once. "He trusted responsibility," I answered. "And he understood that the three of you deserved time to become who you were meant to be without worrying about losing your home." Daniel ran a hand through his hair and looked back at the document again. "So legally," he said slowly, "this house has belonged to you for 50 years. "Yes," I said. "It has." The weight of that truth seemed to settle across the room like dust floating quietly in sunlight. Michael stepped back a few inches, no longer leaning toward the table with the same certainty as before. Linda moved toward one of the dining chairs and sat down carefully, her purse resting in her lap. Daniel remained standing, but his posture had softened. For the first time that afternoon, he looked less like a man negotiating a transaction and more like a younger brother remembering something he had almost forgotten. "You paid the mortgage," he said quietly, as if the pieces were finally connecting in his mind. "Every month," I replied, "even after all of you moved away." Michael glanced around the living room again, noticing details that had always been there but rarely noticed. The repaired corner of the bookshelf, the polished wooden floor, the carefully framed photographs along the wall. "And the repairs," he added slowly. I nodded. "Those too." The silence returned again, but this time it felt different. Not tense. Reflective. The kind of quiet that follows when people realize a story they believed for years was missing an important chapter. Daniel looked at me again, his voice quieter than before. "Margaret," he said, "we thought the house was part of the inheritance for all of us." I met his eyes calmly. "I know," I answered. "And I never corrected that assumption because I hoped something else would matter more than paperwork." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I looked around the room one more time, taking in the walls, the furniture, the familiar sunlight filtering through the curtains. Then I looked back at my younger siblings, who had once depended on me for everything. "I hoped that family would matter more than property," I said gently. "But sometimes people only understand the value of something after they try to take it away." Daniel remained standing near the coffee table, staring down at the document as if the thin sheet of paper had suddenly become heavier than anything he had expected to carry that afternoon. Michael slowly lowered himself into the armchair near the window, his earlier certainty replaced by a thoughtful quiet. Linda sat with both hands folded around her purse, her eyes drifting across the room as if she were seeing the house not as property, but as memory. The afternoon light continued to move gently across the walls, touching the framed photographs that had quietly watched our lives unfold for decades. For a while no one spoke. The silence did not feel hostile anymore. It felt reflective, like the moment after someone finishes telling a story that changes the way everyone understands the past. Daniel finally looked up again, his voice softer than it had been since the conversation began. "Margaret," he said slowly, "I think we misunderstood a lot of things." I gave a small nod, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement. "That happens sometimes," I said calmly. "Time has a way of smoothing out details until the truth becomes harder to see." Michael leaned forward slightly in his chair, resting his elbows on his knees. "All those years," he said thoughtfully, "you carried the responsibility for this house and never once mentioned that it was legally yours." I met his gaze gently. "Responsibility does not need an announcement," I replied. "It simply needs to be done." Linda's eyes moved toward the photograph of our father on the mantel. "He must have known you would protect this place," she said quietly. "He knew someone had to," I answered. Daniel walked slowly toward the window and looked out at the oak tree in the yard, the same tree he used to climb when he was a boy. For a moment he rested his hand against the glass, lost in his own memories. "When I was 10 years old," he said thoughtfully, "I remember falling out of that tree and scraping my knee. You carried me inside and cleaned it up before Mom even came downstairs." I smiled faintly. "You cried more because you thought you were in trouble than because of the scrape." A quiet chuckle escaped him, though it faded quickly as the present returned. He turned back toward me with a different expression now, one that carried both respect and regret. "I think we forgot something important," he admitted. "We started thinking about the house like it was just another asset." I walked slowly across the room and straightened the picture frame on the mantel, adjusting it the way I had done hundreds of times before. "That happens when people grow busy with their own lives," I said. "Years pass. Memories become shorter. And sometimes gratitude fades into assumption." Michael nodded slowly. "We assumed the house would always be here waiting for us," he said. "We did not think about the person who kept it that way." Linda looked at me carefully, her voice almost hesitant. "Margaret," she said, "what are you planning to do now?" I considered the question for a moment, glancing around the room that had shaped so many chapters of our family's story. The living room looked exactly the same as it had that morning. The sofa cushions were slightly worn from years of use. The curtains moved gently in the breeze coming through the open window. The familiar scent of old wood and fresh coffee lingered faintly in the air. Yet something about the room felt different now, as if a truth that had been hidden quietly beneath the surface had finally stepped into the light. I turned back toward my younger siblings and spoke with the calm clarity that only comes after a lifetime of carrying responsibilities without complaint. "For 50 years," I said gently, "this house has been the place where our family could always return. That was the promise I made to myself the night our father passed away." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding forming across his face. "And now?" he asked quietly. I looked at each of them in turn, seeing not the adults who had walked through the door earlier that afternoon, but the children who once depended on me to keep the world steady beneath their feet. "Now," I said calmly, "I am deciding what the next chapter of that promise should be." Daniel remained quiet after my last words, his eyes moving slowly around the room, as if he was trying to see the house the way I had seen it all these years. Michael leaned back in the chair by the window, the confidence he carried earlier replaced by a thoughtful stillness. Linda sat with both hands folded in her lap, her gaze resting on the old photograph of our father on the mantel. The afternoon sun had begun to soften now, turning the light in the room warmer and calmer, the way it often did near the end of the day. I walked slowly across the living room, my steps familiar against the wooden floor that had been polished so many times over the years. Every board beneath my feet held a memory. The spot near the hallway where Daniel once practiced tying his shoelaces for the first time. The corner near the staircase where Michael sat with his science projects spread across the floor. The small mark beside the kitchen doorway where Linda accidentally dropped a suitcase the day she left for college. For a long moment, I simply stood there, taking in the quiet presence of a place that had been both shelter and responsibility for most of my life. Daniel finally spoke again, his voice careful now, almost respectful. "Margaret," he said, "earlier today we came here thinking about numbers and property values. I do not think we understood what this house actually meant to you." I gave a small nod. "It meant stability," I said gently. "It meant keeping a promise." Michael leaned forward slightly, resting his hands together. "When you said you were deciding the next chapter," he asked, What exactly does that mean? I looked toward the window where the branches of the oak tree moved slowly in the breeze. That tree had watched our entire family grow older. It had stood there through every season, just as this house had. For many years, I said quietly, I believed my responsibility was simply to hold everything together, to make sure this house remained a place where each of you could return if you ever needed it. Linda's voice came softly from across the room. And now, I turned back toward them and met their eyes calmly. Now I am 72 years old, I said, and I am beginning to understand something that took me a long time to learn. The room grew very still again. Even the sound of the clock seemed distant for a moment. Daniel stepped closer, listening carefully. Responsibility does not last forever, I continued. At some point a person has to decide whether they are living for others, or finally living for themselves. Michael nodded slowly as if the thought had never occurred to him before. Linda looked thoughtful, her expression gentler than it had been earlier in the afternoon. I walked toward the coffee table and carefully placed the folder back inside the cabinet where it had rested quietly for so many years. Then I returned to the center of the living room. This house has done its job, I said softly. It kept our family together long enough for all of you to build your own lives. Daniel looked around the room again, this time with something close to appreciation in his expression. I think we forgot how much of our story lives inside these walls, he said. Stories do not disappear, I replied calmly. They simply move forward with the people who remember them. Michael stood up from the chair and walked a few steps across the room, his eyes pausing on the old bookshelf near the fireplace. If you decide to sell the house someday, he said slowly, that decision should belong to you alone. Linda nodded in agreement. You carried this responsibility longer than anyone expected, she added. I listened to their words without rushing to answer. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip lower behind the oak tree, casting long golden lines across the living room floor. For the first time that afternoon, the tension that had filled the house earlier seemed to fade into something quieter, something closer to understanding. I folded my hands together and spoke with a calm certainty that surprised even me. For most of my life, I believed my role was to protect this home for everyone else, I said gently. But perhaps the final chapter of this story is not about the house at all. Perhaps it is about finally choosing what kind of life I want to live next. The room stayed quiet after my last words, the kind of quiet that does not feel uncomfortable but reflective, as if everyone present is slowly adjusting to a truth that has finally surfaced after many years. The late afternoon sunlight continued to stretch across the wooden floor, reaching toward the old bookshelf and the coffee table where the document had rested only minutes earlier. I stood near the center of the living room and looked around once more, not with sadness but with the calm recognition that every chapter of life eventually reaches a turning point. Daniel slowly walked toward the photograph of our father on the mantel and studied it carefully. His shoulders no longer carried the rigid certainty he had brought with him earlier that day. He believed in you, Daniel said quietly. I nodded gently. He believed in responsibility, I replied. Michael remained near the window, watching the branches of the oak tree sway lightly in the breeze. For years that tree had marked the seasons of our lives. Spring blossoms when we were children, summer shade when we played outside, autumn leaves falling across the yard as we grew older and began leaving home one by one. Linda stood and walked slowly across the room, her fingers brushing the back of the old dining chair, as if reconnecting with memories she had not visited in a long time. I remember the night before my first job interview, she said softly. You stayed up with me until midnight helping me practice what I was going to say. I smiled faintly at the memory. You were convinced they would not hire you, I said. Linda laughed quietly. And you told me confidence was something you practiced until it became real. Daniel looked back at me then, a thoughtful expression replacing the tension that had once filled the room. You have been doing that for all of us your entire life, he said. I did not answer right away. Instead, I walked toward the window and rested my hand lightly against the frame, feeling the warmth of the fading sunlight on the glass. Outside, the quiet neighborhood continued its ordinary rhythm. A car passed slowly down the street. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, and then fell silent again. Life was moving forward the way it always does, steady and patient. For many years I believed my purpose was to keep this house ready for all of you, I said finally. Not because I owned it, but because it represented something important. A place where our family began. Michael turned toward me and nodded slowly. And you did that, he said, better than anyone else could have. Linda stepped closer and placed her hand gently on my arm. But now it is time for you to think about yourself, she added. I looked at each of them carefully, seeing not only the adults they had become, but also the children they once were, standing in this same room asking for help with homework, laughing during birthday dinners, or falling asleep on the couch after long summer days. The years between those moments and this afternoon suddenly felt both very long and very short at the same time. Perhaps that is true, I said quietly. Perhaps the final responsibility I have is to choose what comes next. Daniel nodded in understanding. Whatever you decide, he said, it should be your decision. The words settled gently in the room, and for the first time that day the house felt peaceful again. Not because the past had changed, but because the truth had finally been spoken aloud. I looked around one last time at the familiar walls, the photographs, the furniture that had quietly witnessed every stage of our family's journey. Then I turned back toward my younger siblings and spoke with the calm certainty that only time can bring. When I was 18 years old, I said softly, I stepped forward because someone had to hold this family together. For many years I believed that was the most important role I would ever have. I paused for a moment, letting the quiet fill the space between us. But life has a way of teaching new lessons, I continued. And sometimes the final lesson is learning when to step forward for yourself. The sun dipped lower behind the oak tree outside the window, casting a warm golden light across the living room floor as the day slowly moved toward evening, carrying with it the closing of one chapter and the quiet beginning of another.